They trespassed on the wrong ranch. I realized at the very moment I saw the glint of metal cutting across my land like a silver scar under the sun. A pipeline, half buried and fresh, carved through my family's soil, the same earth my father died defending. The HOA board thought they could intimidate me like they do, their suburban residents with their pathetic violation notices and threats. They had no idea who I was or what power I quietly owned. I should have confronted them that first day. I noticed the construction. But a part of me wanted to let them finish getting tangled in their own trap, because in the end, the water they were so desperate to steal from beneath my ranch would choke them and I would be the one pulling the lever. The wind carried the scent of dust and diesel as I approached the trench where workers hurried like ants. They didn't even look at me, probably didn't think a rancher in muddy boots was someone worth acknowledging. They would learn. My fists clenched at my sides, nails digging into my palms. As I watched one of the bulldozers roll right over the edge of a watering pond my father handcrafted for generations of cattle. The pond was the heart of my land, the lifeblood of the livestock, and the one place where memories of him were still vivid. And these strangers were desecrating it under orders from some arrogant HOA president who believed he owned the town. Rage burned hotter than the noon sun, but I kept still, silent, calculating. For 3 weeks no one sent a notice. No request for an easement, not even a courteous warning. They assumed my land was nothing more than an inconvenient stretch of dirt between their cookie-cutter community and the nearest utility connection. They never checked the deed. They never checked the corporate registry. They never checked who controlled the water source. If they had, they would have known the ranch they were cutting through didn't merely sit over a groundwater supply legally. Owned the private company that managed the pipeline network there. Whole damn community depended on. My father left me the ranch. My uncle left me the water company. Together, the two gave me power almost no one understood. But the HOA was about to. It all started when a letter showed up in my mailbox. Not from them, but from a lawyer. My lawyer alerting me to a sudden surge in water demands from the neighboring subdivision. The kind of spike that only comes when someone illegally taps into a main. So I drove the fence line, and there it was, gleaming, unauthorized, illegal. My blood froze before it boiled again. My land rights had been violated, my ownership stolen, and nobody had even bothered to ask my permission. They mistook my silence for weakness. They mistook my distance from town for apathy. They mistook me for someone they could push aside. I made a call that night. Standing on my porch under a bruised sky full of stars that didn't give a damn about greed or property lines. I ordered the records, the permits, the entire paper trail tied to the pipeline installation. My attorney sent everything over within hours. Every document confirmed the same truth. There was no documentation. No authorization? Nothing. They bypassed the city. They bypassed zoning. They cut into private land like thieves in broad daylight. Why? Because they thought I didn't matter. The subdivision was growing fast. New homes popping up like weeds. Prices rising. HOA, fees doubling. They needed water clean, reliable, affordable water, and their existing supply was strained. So the board, led by that smug bastard Richard Halston, decided in one of their polished, well-catered meetings to just take mine. The deed to my ranch clearly marked the mineral and water rights belonging to mere rights they violated. They thought I would sue, maybe settle, waste years in court while they pumped my resources dry. But lawsuits were for people who still believed in fairness. I believed in consequences. I visited their community the next morning, dressed clean but unimpressive, to see what kind of people I was dealing with. Men mowing perfect lawns with robotic precision. Women gossiping behind tinted sunglasses about whose shrubs were a quarter-inch too tall according to their sacred guidelines. Kids riding bikes, oblivious to the empire their parents pretended to rule. A notice of violation truck slowly patrolled the streets like some HOA-branded law enforcement. Their world was built on the illusion of power, a few signatures, a few absurd rules, and they thought they controlled lives. I caught the eyes of Halston himself as he strutted out of the clubhouse in a blazer too tight for his bulging pride. He looked at me like I was lost, an outsider who had no right to walk their polished sidewalks. I held his stare. He didn't like that. He approached with the slimy confidence of a man who always gets his way. "You're not from here," he said, as if that fact made me unworthy of oxygen. "No," I replied. "But your pipeline is from my ranch." He blinked. Confusion, then irritation, then dismissal flickered across his face. He gave a short laugh. "You must be mistaken. We have full authorization." "Show me," I said. His jaw flexed, but he smirked. "That's confidential HOA business." "Then maybe I should talk to the company delivering the water." His laugh stopped. His eyes narrowed. "And who are you to do that?" "I own it." Silence cut sharp between us. His tongue twitched like he wanted to spit out a denial, but uncertainty strangled him. He tried to recover, tried to puff himself up again, but the seed of fear had already been planted. "Well, I'll have my legal team confirm that." He turned away too quickly, retreating faster than a rat that realized the trap was closing. Good, I thought. Run, because I'm done playing nice. 2 more days passed. Construction finished. Their pipeline was now hidden beneath my land. They thought they had succeeded. I waited. I watched their sprinklers kick on. Water flowing freely into pristine lawns, manicured like museum exhibits. They toasted their accomplishment at their community pool. The HOA website proudly announced improved water availability thanks to new infrastructure upgrades. I saved the page as evidence. Then came the night I decided to shut them down. The control panel was in my pump house, a small building wrapped in vines. Hidden by generations of family hands who understood the importance of keeping what is ours protected. My father used to say, "Water's life. Control water and you control everything downstream." I always thought he was speaking metaphorically. Turns out he meant it literally. I flipped the main. Instantly the hum of machinery deep in the earth slowed. Pipes depressurized. Valves sealed. The lifeline to the HOA subdivision collapsed, and I smiled. By dawn, panic had erupted. Residents flooded the HOA office, demanding answers. Faucets sputtered nothing but air. Toilets refused to flush. The golf course grass turned thirsty within hours. Halston was forced to face them, sweat glistening under the pressure of angry homeowners banging on the glass doors. That was when my lawyer served him. A cease and desist. A demand for full restitution. A notice of criminal trespass and theft of resources. They were caught. Dead to rights. My lawyer also included a final line in bold print. The water supply will remain disconnected until the matter is resolved to the satisfaction of the landowner. That landowner being me. Now they knew. Now they understood the stakes. But I wasn't done. Not even close. Because this wasn't just about legal victories or shutting off their precious lawns. This was personal. They dug up the resting place of my father's legacy. They disrespected the land that raised me. They tried to treat me like nothing. I would show them what nothing feels like. So if you think power lies in suburban rules and board meetings, think again. The real power is beneath the ground they took for granted, and I'm ready to unleash it. Keep reading, because what comes next isn't just revenge. It's justice carved into the earth itself. If you want to see how deep this goes, then don't you dare stop here, because the pipeline is only the beginning. They came at dawn with glossy trucks and polite smiles. A fleet of municipal ignorance that believed paperwork and polite nods could paper over theft. They had no idea their stolen water ran through valves and meters that I alone could touch. No clue that the very company name on their invoices had my signature hidden in corporate runoff that my uncle had set up years ago to protect the family's assets from slick developers and sleepy bankers. I watched them from the ridge where the mesquite hedged the old fence, a single silhouette against the rising sun, and I let them pat themselves on the back while I cataloged every face that would soon need to learn the price of arrogance. Halston organized a town hall that evening at the clubhouse. The kind of theater where men in polos with impossible tans stood at podiums to read triumphs that belonged to someone else. He talked about community water access, about working together, about reaching across fences, words wrapped in honey meant to distract. I sat near the back. where the acoustics swallowed the applause and left only the small sounds of nervous laughter and the clink of plastic cups. When it was my turn to speak, I did not stand up and make the kind of grand, righteous speech they expected. Instead, I submitted a crisp, legal packet to their attorney through my own lawyer. A paper trail heavy with the kind of quiet authority that removes smiles. The room cooled. Conversations slanted toward whispers. People who had been so sure of their moral high ground suddenly began looking for exits. Halston's jaw worked like a trapped animal's. He smiled for a camera that didn't flash. He tried to palm the humiliation away with a joke, but it rattled when the municipality's code inspector called the next morning to inform the HOA that an immediate halt had been ordered pending investigation. The workers were shepherded off my property with all the cheer of men rescued from a sinking ship, which in the cold light of truth was exactly what they were: laborers whose paychecks were written by a board that believed greed excused lying. They left behind a trench and the thin, arrogant ribbon of a pipe that dug through the old grazing field and across the head of the spring. I walked that pipeline, fingers trailing along the exposed steel like a man tracing an enemy's scars. And I mapped every clamp and joint with the sort of intimate attention one reserves for family heirlooms. Even buried secrets leave a scent. The welds smelled of metal and cheap ceiling compound, and the earth where they'd been laid was churned into a different color. The mark of human intervention on the quiet business of nature. Farmers from neighboring properties came by out of curiosity and solidarity, bringing the blunt kindness unique to people who work with the land. They remembered my father. They told stories about the way he'd walked the creeks in boots that knew every root and rock, the way he'd refused to sell when offers came from developers with perfumes and patience. People like that understand legacy. They handed me jars of coffee and told me to be careful. They offered tractors and witnesses. That small, crucial house of neighbors would prove to be more valuable than most legal briefs, because the truth the earth reveals is harder to refute than any scripted testimony. Meanwhile, Halston scrubbed his digital presence, removing the celebratory posts and changing the language on the HOA website to infrastructure improvements postponed pending review. But scrub as he might, cached memories and screenshots haunt men who play fast with other people's rights. The internet does not forget, and I had already archived everything. Within days, the story leaked beyond the subdivision. The local paper ran a cautious piece about a dispute over a private easement. The second paragraph mentioned my name. That was all it took to stir the social hornets. Neighbors who had nodded politely now spoke openly at grocery stores and church gatherings, some in my favor, some fulminating on half-truths they'd been told by the HOA. Complaints started flooding the board's inbox. Questions landed at the county planner's office about the legality of pipeline installations across private holdings. Halston held emergency sessions and pointed fingers so aggressively it was as if the motion itself might deflect the guilt. He hired consultants and PR firms that promised to spin a narrative of collaborative community improvement. They tried to turn the cameras toward me by casting me as a stubborn obstructionist who refused to be part of the greater good. The irony that this greater good had begun with a theft of mine went unremarked by those desperate to keep their manicured lives uninterrupted. I began to dig not in a literal way at first, but into records that men like Halston assume are dull and impenetrable: county registries, water rights filings, corporation ledgers, transaction histories stretching back decades. The deeper I went, the more I found the deliberate fingerprints of evasion and silence. Transfers executed late on Fridays. Shell companies formed and dissolved. Signatures that matched in ways calculators call coincidences, but law calls malpractice. There were authors of these papers in suits and stations of power who preferred the language of opacity, who wrote clauses in softly rounded prose that meant ownership could be hidden from the casual observer. The water company my uncle had organized had been structured precisely to avoid that kind of corporate theater. Paper thin on the surface, but solid and threaded with trustees and clauses that would, if needed, bind any attempted theft to a legal and financial chain strong enough to pull moral ambivalence into courtroom lights. I assembled this evidence into a package the size of a small book, mailed it to the county, 2 media contacts, 2 watchdog groups. I sent copies to the HOA attorneys, who suddenly had to answer to something other than smug neighbors. Every page was a small detonator, and I arranged them in an order that made the implosion inevitable. Paper first, then calls, then pressure. Money can silence for a while, but attention breaks silence quicker than most people imagine. As the heat rose, Halston panicked. He called me twice, once with the thin courtesy of a man trying to patch a drip in his reputation. Once with the ferocity of a man whose privilege was slipping. His first call was rehearsed. "We can negotiate," he offered, as if ownership were a bargaining chip for good behavior. "We can compensate you." He spoke the word like it was currency that would soothe conscience. But his offers were petty and calibrated so precisely they barely covered legal fees. I laughed and told him to check his accounts for the many things that could be turned. The dignity of neighbors who were lied to. The hours of labor spent on his behalf under false pretenses. The water itself, which, once corrupted by greed, loses its simplicity. He tried the old suburban gambit appeal to appearances, to the community narratives he controlled. I told him he couldn't buy what he had stolen. That made him furious. The second call arrived 3 days later in the redder hours of the night, threats wrapped as warnings about consequences. "You don't want this to get ugly," he said. "You don't want people to see what your family was involved in years ago." It was a cheap blackmail attempt, the kind that stinks of panic and the assumption that everyone has skeletons, that the threat of exposure will keep the truth caged. But secrets decay. If there were skeletons, I already knew the shape of each bone. I didn't even pretend to care. Threats, I have learned, are the currency of cowardice. While Halston raged in polite, papered ways, other pressure mounted from an unexpected angle. Residents, who genuinely feared what the shutoff meant for elderly relatives with medical needs, for families with infants, for small businesses that relied on steady water. My goal was not to punish innocence. It was to remove the sense of impunity that allowed the HOA to steal. So I authorized emergency water deliveries to vulnerable residence trucks that ran at night to provide for the sick and the old. Discreet and efficient, paid for from escrow accounts that would later be reconciled with claims and reparations. I wanted the community to understand there is a difference between withholding water as leverage against a syndicate of greed and abandoning people who need help. That distinction mattered morally and strategically. Word spread first as rumor and then as gratitude. Some residents wrote to the county on my behalf. A few people who had once applauded Halston's improvements quietly withdrew their support. The social center began to wobble. Halston's PR team tried to reframe the narrative. They called it a complicated, unfortunate dispute and calls for calm. But calm in the face of wrongdoing is a form of collusion. The county summoned everyone to mediation, which Halston accepted publicly and then tried to foot drag behind closed doors. He proposed temporary easements with fees. He suggested joint ownership with oversight committees that would be staffed by his allies. It was a plan designed to dilute liability and cloak ongoing control. I rejected it outright. My terms were simple and non-negotiable. Immediate removal of the pipeline from my property, full restoration of the land, public apology, and reimbursement for the cost of the illegal installation, along with punitive damages for willful trespass. Anything less would be an insult wrapped in civility. That stance antagonized a lot of comfortable people, but it also clarified to everyone what this fight was about: the sanctity of ownership and the courage to enforce it. As the county prepared for a formal hearing, my opponents tried one last gambit. They leaked a rumor about my family's water company being financially unstable. The tensions that simmer beneath comfortable lives eventually erupt, and the HOA community was no exception. Deprived of easy water and stripped of their illusion of control, residents began turning on the very board they once praised. I watched it unfold like a distant storm quiet. Rumbles of dissatisfaction growing into sharp thunder that rattled windows and reputations alike. Halston clung to his authority with the desperation of a man who'd bet everything on a bluff. He still believed appearances could save him. He called for yet another emergency meeting in the clubhouse. And though I had no desire to watch his theatrics again, I made sure someone else did. A sympathetic resident named Claire, sharp-minded, unafraid, and tired of being lied, Tuss streamed the meeting to me privately. She positioned her phone low and discreet, capturing every flinch, every raised voice, every crack in the board's facade. The meeting began with Halston trying to maintain order, but order had abandoned him. Residents rose from their neat rows of chairs like a ragged wave, shouting about dry taps, unusable bathrooms, lawns dying under the sun, and the thousands they'd spent on infrastructure improvements that had led only to embarrassment. One man yelled that his wife had nearly collapsed from dehydration. A mother demanded to know why her newborn had to be bathed using bottled water. Fear had turned into fury, and fury has no patience for political niceties. Halston tried to shift blame toward the county, toward me, toward circumstances he insisted were unforeseeable. But every time he tried to point fingers, another resident slapped down his excuses with invoices, photos, and screenshots of his own celebratory posts. The truth boxed him in from all corners, and for the first time, I saw genuine fear in his eyes. Fear not of justice, but of losing status. The board fractured under pressure. A couple of members publicly resigned, their faces crumpled with shame. One muttered something about just doing what we were told, a coward's anthem. But cowards fleeing a sinking ship only make the captain drown more obviously. The room demanded solutions. Halston promised water tankers, promised discounts, promised action. Promises just more empty air. Someone shouted that he would be recalled. Others cheered. The crowd was a riot threatening to ignite, but they didn't yet see the whole picture. Their anger was aimed only at the damage done to their lawns and comfort. They didn't know the worst harm lay underground, where the spring that fed my land and supplied my company had been punctured carelessly, its natural flow disrupted. The ecological cost would take years to repair. I knew this fight wasn't only about justice for MIT, was about the land itself. As residents stormed out of the clubhouse, Claire kept streaming. She whispered that many planned to come to my ranch to apologize and ask for help. I told her to let them come. I needed them to see the scars with their own eyes. 2 days later, a caravan of SUVs, sedans, and dusty pickups wound down my dirt road. People stepped onto my property with shoulders hunched, wariness etched into their faces. This was not their world. They were far from tidy lawns and uniform fences. Some clutched bottles of water in nervous hands, others carried nothing but pride swallowed hard. I stood by the torn earth, waiting as they approached hesitantly. The first to speak was Claire, her voice steady despite the awkwardness. "We didn't know," she said. "He told us the land was unused, that nobody cared about it." The words struck harder than they sounded. Nobody cared. That was the core of the disrespect, the assumption that rural land was lesser simply because it wasn't manicured and overregulated. I led them along the path of destruction. The trench, through once healthy soil, the cracked clay where the topsoil lost its moisture, the pond's edge still bruised by machinery. I watched their faces shift from apology to genuine remorse. Some teared up quietly. Others cursed Halston under their breath. A little boy asked why the water wasn't flowing like on TV. His mother pressed her hand to her mouth, unable to answer. One older man stepped forward. He introduced himself as Jacob Reed Tired, hands rough enough to show he once worked the land himself before HOA bylaws and convenience took over his life. He knelt and scooped a fistful of dirt, letting it run through his fingers like a lost memory. "This isn't a small mistake," he said softly. "This is desecration." His voice trembled with disappointment that bordered on anger. His words carried weight, and others nodded. They began asking what they could do, how they could help restore what had been damaged, how they could fight the corruption that had tricked them into complicity. I wasn't used to allies, but maybe justice wasn't meant to be carried alone. I laid out the next steps plainly. The county injunction had forced repairs, but oversight would be necessary. Environmental experts would need access. Volunteers could help document damage and monitor the work crews. Most importantly, the community needed to demand transparency and accountability, publicly and loudly. People like Halston thrived in darkness and bureaucracy. To defeat them, we needed sunlight and persistence. The group agreed. Phones came out, notes were taken, plans formed. For the first time, HOA community, at least those standing on my soil, seemed willing to fight for something bigger than their lawns. But Halston wasn't done. That night, the intimidation began. Pickup trucks idled just outside my fence line, lights off but engines rumbling like warning growls. I saw silhouettes inside men who carried themselves with entitlement, not courage. They thought fear would make me yield. They thought solitude meant vulnerability. But this was my land, and the night was my ally. Coyotes howled from the hills, answering a primal truth. Predators survive by knowing their territory. And I knew every inch better than the men cowering behind tinted glass. Still, they made their message clear. There would be consequences if I continued, as if that would ever deter me. A day later, a county official called with news. The HOA had filed an appeal and requested a stay on the restoration order. They argued economic hardship, claimed repairs would devastate community finances. I laughed bitterly. Their finances would tremble because they broke the law. Was that my burden to shoulder? Halston's strategy was obvious. Stall until people grew tired, drag the process until outrage cooled. It was a cowardly path paved by rich men who think time will erase accountability. But they underestimated something crucial. I had no deadline, no board pressuring me, no image to protect. I had patience sharpened by grief and grit. The kind forged through years of ranch life, where waiting out storms is a daily ritual. So I fired back. My lawyer filed a countersuit demanding punitive damages and full investigative audits into HOA financial dealings, including the shady approvals that fast-tracked their illegal project. If Halston wanted to play legal chicken, he was accelerating toward a collision he wasn't built to survive. Media attention exploded. Reporters showed up at the subdivision, shoving microphones into Halston's face while he sweated under scrutiny. He tried to brush off concerns with corporate jargon, but the cracks were too wide to seal. Social media lit up with memes dragging the HOA's arrogance. People online loved a story where power toppled and the underdog held the switch controlling the water supply. Hashtags formed. Support spread. Suddenly, the quiet rancher they ignored had become the central figure in a drama the world wanted to see resolved. But attention can be a wildfire, useful in clearing out rot, but dangerous if it spreads too fast. I received messages from strangers praising me, urging harsher retaliation. Some wanted sabotage, destruction, revenge beyond reason. I deleted those messages. Justice without discipline becomes vengeance without end. My father didn't raise me to destroy, only to defend what's rightfully ours. Still, the weight of leadership pressed heavy. I spent nights pacing the porch, staring at the stars, as if they might offer some cosmic approval. The cattle moved in the distance, hooves crunching dry ground that shouldn't have been that dry not this time of year. The spring's disruption was worse than I'd first thought. Geological shifts don't heal quickly. Water that once flowed with certainty now hesitated. That frightened me more than any truck at my fence line. I needed experts. I needed evidence. I needed allies who understood the language of groundwater the way my father had taught me. I called every hydrologist within the region. Most were booked or uninterested in a fight against a homeowners association, till one woman named Dr. Evelyn Royce listened. Her voice carried a seriousness that silenced other worries. She promised to come out within the week. Said this kind of disruption, if left unchecked, could permanently alter the aquifer. Her involvement turned the next chapter of this battle into something larger than personal property. It became an environmental fight. And people pay attention when the land itself is at risk. Not everyone who came to help had noble intentions, though. Among the supportive residents were opportunists, those who smelled blood in the water and wanted a taste of power. A man named Spencer, slick hair and sharper smile, approached me privately, talked about investments and partnerships, hinting at profiting from scandal. He suggested selling water rights for development condos and golf expansions. He tried to flatter me with visions of wealth and legacy wrapped in progress. I told him to get off my land before I reminded him what progress looked like before men in suits came along to ruin it. He left in a huff, but not before muttering. They thought locking the gate and threatening me with legal action would keep me out of the HOA office. They forgot who owns the water running through every pipe in their pristine little paradise. I rose before the sun, boots crunching frostbitten grass, as I walked out to my barn, the place where real power lived. My equipment wasn't just for cattle ranching anymore. I opened the large steel cabinet and laid out the tools of leverage. Pressure regulators, flow restrictors, mainline transmitters. The HOA's pipeline might have cut through my land, but the source, all 480 feet underground, belonged solely to me. And today they would learn exactly what that meant. Mara padded over, tail wagging, sensing something electric in the air. "Come on, girl," I muttered, giving her head a scratch. "Let's go turn off their comfort." The early morning sky was painted with the faintest pink glow as I drove my truck toward the control shed that housed the water system. The padlock snapped open with a satisfying click, and the familiar scent of damp earth and cold metal greeted me. I stepped inside and flipped on the panel lights. Digital readouts lit up like a command center, water pressure, flow speed, reservoir levels, under my fingertips. They wanted to fight? Fine, let's pick the battlefield. I slid my finger to the main flow regulator. "Let's start with a warning," I murmured, turning the small dial from 100% down to 15%. Not enough to cut off water completely, just enough to ruin every shower, clog every sprinkler, and make every faucet sputter like a dying fish. The HOA would panic, but panic was only the first course. I radioed my ranch foreman, Hank. "Turn on the cameras," I ordered. "Watch the neighborhood entrances. I want to see the chaos live." Hank chuckled darkly. "Already on it, boss?" I leaned back in the old wooden chair, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the monitors. The first sign of discomfort hit the yoga moms. Their morning showers turned into drips. Their pastel-tinted coffee machines beeped helplessly. They scrambled into driveways with wet hair and towels wrapped around them, frantically tapping at their phones as their manicured lawns gasped for moisture. Watching them run like frantic hens would have been humorous if I wasn't so deadly serious. A text message vibrated through the office system, broadcast emergency alert from HOA board, water disruption. Possibly system error. Please remain calm. A little early for begging, isn't it? My smirk faded as I noticed something on the fourth monitor, construction trucks back at the trench, already patching the leak I caused. They weren't just determined, they were desperate. And that meant I needed to apply more pressure. If they thought they were going to finish that pipeline and keep ignoring me, they were in for a rude awakening. The biggest mistake they'd ever made was assuming I'd sit quietly, because I looked like some boots and denim rancher with a friendly dog. They assumed I was powerless. But power isn't about rules. It's about ownership. And I owned their water. I punched a code into the security console and pulled up the HOA's water usage log. Household by household. Who used what? Who wasted the most? My eyes locked on one entry. The HOA president herself, Barbara Sterling. Weekly average usage, triple everyone else. It figured. She watered her roses as if she were reviving an ancient species, washed her SUV daily like a shrine to suburban vanity, and filled her oversized tub every night to bathe away the guilt she didn't even feel. She was my best target. I rerouted the pressure restrictions to her supply line first, full shutoff. The system chimed with a metallic beep, confirming my command. "Enjoy your dry morning, Barbara," but I wasn't finished. The pipeline that ran across my land, it had a control valve buried beneath the main access gate on my side of the fence, one the HOA didn't know even existed. I grabbed a wrench, slammed the truck door shut, and drove out to the gate. As I approached, Mara growled. A black SUV was parked just outside the ranch entrance. 3 men in suits stepped forward, hands tucked inside their jackets like they were hiding something more than arrogance. Barbara Sterling herself stood between them, arms crossed tightly, lips pursed into a thin line. "Mr. McAllister," she called out sharply, "we need to talk." I asked, stepping out of the truck. "Because from where I stand, you only show up when you want something. We have the authority to complete essential infrastructure improvements. You are obstructing progress." "Funny," I drawled, leaning casually against my truck. "From my perspective, progress looks like trespassing. Her eyes narrowed. "We will pay you damages for the land use. Just tell us your number." I stared at her, silent, let her words rot in the cold morning air. She continued, voice dripping with entitlement. "The community cannot function without that pipeline completed. We expect your cooperation." I walked closer, boots crunching gravel. "Barbara, that water you treat like a convenience? It comes from my well. It's my land. My money built the company that keeps your toilets flushing. And you thought you could cut across my ranch without even knocking on my door?" Her fake confidence faltered, a crack in her porcelain facade. She glanced subtly at her men, signaling them to take a step closer, toward the fence gate. Intimidation tactic. Cute. Before they could say a word, I reached down to the ground and yanked up the steel cover of the hidden control valve. Dust puffed into the air. All eyes locked on my hands. "What? What is that?" Barbara asked, voice suddenly high-pitched. "It's your last chance," I said calmly. "Either we negotiate on my terms, or your entire neighborhood learns what life looks like without a single drop." Her face turned white. "You wouldn't dare." I bent down, gripping the wrench, and twisted the valve clockwise. Half a turn. That's all it took. Hank radioed through instantly. "Pressure's falling to 0. The whole development is offline." Barbara lunged toward the fence like a wild thing, shouting, "Stop. You can't do this." Her guards grabbed her shoulders, afraid she might embarrass herself further. Too late for that. I stood tall, eyes locked on hers with the calm rage of a man pushed too far. "Barbara," I said quietly. I asked nicely. "I even warned you. But you forced my hand." The men in suits whispered urgently into their earpieces. Phones began buzzing. People in the neighborhood were waking up to find nothing. No water for the kids, no showers, no morning coffee. Pure suburban terror. Barbara tried to compose herself, smoothing down her cardigan, forcing her voice into something resembling polite authority. We'll take legal action. The city will intervene." I stepped closer to the fence. Only one thin line separated us. "Then let them," I whispered. "They'll find out the same thing you just did. Power starts at the source." Fuck. I held the wrench like a scepter of judgment. "Now leave my property." Her glare burned into me like acid. But she turned sharply and marched toward the SUV. One guard paused and muttered, "This isn't over." I smiled coldly. "No, it's just getting started." The SUV peeled away, tires spinning gravel. Mara barked after them, satisfied to chase off intruders. I returned to the control shed, adrenaline still pulsing through me. I checked the monitors again. Chaos had evolved into desperation. Residents dragged buckets to the HOA clubhouse, but even the public taps were dry. The repair crew abandoned the pipeline trench pointless now with no supply. I settled into the chair, breathing slowly. Let them stew. Let them sweat. Let them understand the consequences of disrespect. But something unexpected flashed onto one of the screens. Another black SUV entering the community. This one wasn't HOA-grade arrogance. It was city-grade trouble. I leaned forward, eyes narrowing. The cavalry had shown up faster than I expected. They were coming to negotiate, or to declare war. Either way, I was ready. Because I wasn't the one running out of water. They were. And I would decide if the taps would flow again. And the moment they thought they'd regained control, that's when I'd unleash the final phase of my plan. A plan that would make them regret ever laying a finger on my land. They sent a delegation from the city, dressed in navy suits and badges that glinted like polished coins. The kind of people who think bureaucracy absolves them of moral responsibility. They arrived with clipboards and smiles, a measured politeness that quickly soured when they realized the taps were dry in half. A subdivision and a rancher had his hands on the valves. Their first question was procedural: who controlled the well? The second was practical: what had we done with the water? I told them the truth in a way that didn't invite debate. It's our well, I said. It always has been. If your HOA wanted access, they should have asked, senior official. Mayor Carter's liaison took notes with a professional detachment. though his jaw tightened when he realized the political fallout that might come from siding with my company against a homeowners association that could mobilize votes and angry phone calls. Politics tastes sweeter than principle most days. He offered to mediate, to convene a working group, to create a plan that would meet both parties halfway. I listened, then said no. Half measures would bury the truth in negotiation and allow a culture of theft to continue. I wanted accountability, not compromises written in comfortable fonts. They had expected me to cave. I didn't. While the city negotiated and the media spun their narratives, I doubled down on the only things that mattered: facts, science, and the slow, unforgiving arithmetic of consequence. Dr. Evelyn. Royce arrived with her field equipment and a quiet efficiency that suggested she had seen this pattern of human arrogance before. Dig for convenience and ignore the rules, then blame the land for consequences. She waded through the wet clay like a priest anointing a wound, testing the sediments, measuring flow rates, and mapping subterranean channels with an accuracy that turned speculation into evidence. Her findings were brutally clear. The illegal installation had not only punctured protective layers, but had diverted the springs' natural flow into the pipeline and away from the ranch's recharge zone. That alone could reduce the spring's output for years. Add to that the possibility of chemical contamination from poorly sealed joints in cheap sealing compounds, and you had a recipe for permanent damage. She wrote pages of dry academic prose and didn't sugarcoat the conclusions. The HOA's action had altered the hydrology substantially and could cause long-term ecological damage unless fully remedied under strict environmental oversight. The report landed like a thunderclap in the local press the next morning and shifted public sympathy in ways that made Halston and his allies sweat anew. The narrative that had painted me as obstructionist cracked into 1,000 pieces under the weight of science. Suddenly, it wasn't only about stubborn property rights. It was about the health of the land and the future of the town's water table. Activists arrived, local environmental groups, and a few national NGOs who smelled a story that tied corporate greed to ecological harm. They brought lawyers with mouths that could bite through bureaucratic obfuscation, and more importantly, they brought public pressure. When ordinary people with cause amplify the facts, the powerful start to shiver. Halston's phone burned. He called donors, pleaded with council members, tried to manufacture sympathy by framing himself as a man saving property values. But the optics were bad. Mothers who had cried in my yard on the day they first saw the trench now stood at council hearings demanding Halston's removal from the board and legal penalties for the HOA's unilateral actions. Even some of his allies, faced with the rigor of scientific reports and citizen outrage, began to distance themselves. The city council, reluctant but realpolitik-driven, voted for a comprehensive environmental audit and suspended the HOA's authority pending the findings. The suspension was a blow. Halston's empire relied on the quiet authority of bylaws and small, humiliating controls that let him micromanage lives. Stripped of them, he flailed. That's when desperation turned deliberate. His first move was illegal blitz filings in multiple courts, injunctions, and aggressive motions designed to drown us in paperwork. He hired a team of high-priced attorneys whose job was to make the calendar so congested no substantive action could be taken. Time, once the ally of the status quo, became his shield. But the law had teeth when you used them properly. My attorneys matched his filings, disputed frivolous motions, and filed discovery requests that required disclosure of HOA meeting minutes, bank statements, and communications with contractors. The documents revealed an ugly pattern: board members approving expenditures without proper bids, off-the-books payments to consultants, and a series of expedited decisions that pointed toward willful ignorance rather than mere incompetence. Evidence metastasized into indictment, and the more we unearthed, the more faces in the community realized they had been misled. Halston, seeing the net tighten, snarled back through other channels. Anonymous letters arrived at the ranch. Tires on my truck were slashed one night, and someone keyed the paint on Barbara Sterling's car, an act meant to both intimidate and signal escalation. The sheriff's deputies stepped up patrols, but you can't patrol decency. You can only enforce consequences after someone crosses a line. I knew the difference between provocation and escalation. I had no desire to be the architect of a spiral into violence. But I also knew that men who think they can take what isn't theirs will escalate to keep their illusion intact. The most disconcerting shift surfaced in the board's sudden embrace of private security consultants. Men with too many teeth and too few manners. They surveilled my property from a distance, made comments about trespass laws, and suggested that I might be provoking the community into legal peril. It was obstruction dressed as defense. I documented every interaction, recorded conversations where allowed, and made sure the sheriff had evidence when things crossed legal thresholds. While the legal and social battles played out in courtrooms and council meetings, I did what I knew how to do best: repair the land. Restoration crews arrived under my supervision, heavy with seed and patience. We regraded the trench correctly this time, took steps to restore the spring's recharge areas, and removed every trace of cheap sealant that might leach into the groundwater. The work was meticulous, tedious, and crucial. It was also the kind of labor that heals not only the soil but the spirit. People from the subdivision showed up as volunteers. Some came with signs of contrition, others with skepticism, but each pair of hands helped lift rocks, plant willow cuttings, and re-establish the riparian buffer that would protect the spring from future disruption. The shared labor stitched a fragile alliance between town and ranch, a bridge built of sore muscles and honest conversation. Not everyone was convinced. Halston's core group remained hostile, their faces hardening like dried mud. But the tide was changing. Where once the HOA's narrative dominated, now a coalition that included farmers, activists, parents, and rational council members began to form. Their demands were simple. I enforced them without malice, full accountability for the illegal actions, binding oversight to prevent future trespass, and restoration funds paid by those responsible. It was justice, not vengeance. Yet even as progress stirred, a new complication arrived: corporate vultures circling the controversy. A developer with a penchant for golf courses and gated communities. People who measure community by manicured greens and membership fees for to buy the HOA out, promising to fix everything if the subdivision agreed to a new water contract. The offer came wrapped in philanthropic language and glossy brochures. In practice, it would shift water control from the local grid to a private network owned by a company that valued profits more than springs. I refused outright. Water commodified under new management would create new vulnerabilities and hand control to outsiders who didn't care whether the creek lived or died. I made my refusal public, and a small but influential faction applauded. The developer's interest, however, had a ripple effect. It intensified desperation among those of Halston's remaining allies. If control could be sold, then maybe the scandal could be spun into an opportunity. That meant we had to move faster. I started to consolidate our gains into concrete protections, legal trusts for the spring, binding covenants attached to deeds in a public registry that documented water rights clearly and permanently. I worked with county officials to draft ordinances that required public notification and environmental sign-off for any future infrastructure projects crossing private land. These weren't small measures. They were the kind of systemic changes that make future theft harder and transparency easier. Halston fought every one of them in the local media, but the evidence and the public mood were no longer on his side. Still, the scariest moments came not in courtrooms, but in the quiet hours. Late-night calls to the sheriff about suspicious activity, the lone flashlight beam bobbing near the pump house, a rock thrown through my barn window with a note that read "Stop." Fear is a persuasive tool, but it is also a poor substitute for evidence and law. We documented everything. We tightened security. We kept working. And when the county announced pending charges for willful trespass and environmental negligence against the HOA's leadership, I felt a cold, clear satisfaction. Not triumph. Exactly nothing about this felt triumphant when the land had been harmed, but a kind of survival pleasure. Those who they thought they had worn me down: legal exhaustion, social pressure. Now the constant low hum of threats meant to fray nerves, but I'm older than their deadlines and harder than their polite little lies. The months of filings and hearings tightened like a noose around their credibility, and every motion they filed to stall only revealed more of their rot. Yet desperation breeds ingenuity in the wrong hands. And Halston's newest gambit was the kind of petty, dangerous thing that's born when privilege meets panic: anonymous accusations. Dirt planted in public records, and a concerted effort to paint me as the aggressor. They wanted to make the moral scales tip back in their favor, to make the community doubt the man who'd shut off their water and repaired their spring, rather than the faction that had stolen it in the first place. That kind of inversion takes effort. And Halston marshaled every resource he had: friends in council rooms, a smear-hungry local radio host, a stack of paid testimonials from people coaxed into rewriting history. I watched it all unfold with the steady, cold patience of someone who knows the value of evidence. Smears scatter like paper in the wind if you have a binder of receipts, sworn statements, and time-stamped photos. I organized everything into folders, digital and hard, copy-layered so thick that the truth would always find its way to daylight. The county investigators leaned on the evidence like a judge on a gavel. The more Halston pushed, the more his allies' inconsistencies swallowed their credibility. But pushing provokes reaction, and reaction can be dangerous. The first break-in was subtle. A gate latch scraped hard enough to leave metal shavings on the dirt, a faint scent of gasoline where the grass should have smelled of hay. Someone attempted to force the pump house door in the gray of dawn. No. But they hadn't reckoned on Hank's vigilance or Mara's noise. The dog tore into the intruder's plans like a thunderclap, and whoever had been inside the truck fled with a howl of embarrassment and anger. The sheriff took fingerprints, interviewed neighbors, and wrote it off as vandalism. But I knew vandalism when I smelled it, the calculated kind that carries a blueprint. Later that week, Hank found thin cuts in the lining of the reservoir, tiny enough to leak slowly on purpose damage that would show up weeks later as contamination if untreated. It was the sort of slow-acting sabotage designed to look like age or accident, the insidious kind of harm that keeps the rest of us busy with cleanup while the guilty continue their schemes. Halston's tactics escalated in other ways too. Anonymous letters accusing my family company of malfeasance arrived at the water board, complete with doctored spreadsheets and falsified audit memos. They popped up on social media, presented by people who didn't ask questions before forwarding lies. Spencer, the slick opportunist from earlier, resurfaced, now with more allies and fewer scruples. He offered himself as a mediator, but his offer was a thinly veiled attempt to extract concessions in exchange for silence. We ignored him. People who profit from scandal never stop. They only change venues. Through all of that, the land was my center of gravity. I spent long, lonely hours walking the creek's edge, checking the willow roots, feeling for the pulse of the spring that fed everything. The hydrologist's work was ongoing. Dr. Royce's team monitored turbidity levels, tested for contaminants, and mapped how the aquifer responded to stress. The data told an anxious story. The spring's output had dipped and begun a slow, uncertain recovery under the right conditions. Nature can heal, but only if you don't keep wounding it. We continued restoration with a stubborn tenderness, replanting, stabilizing banks, and engineering a small retention basin to help recharge the aquifer during storms. Volunteers came in waves, some filled with guilt and practical sweat, others with a cautious interest in being on the right side of history. There was something humbling about people who once looked down their noses at my land, now bending to pull roots free of tired soil. The work healed more than the land. It mended fractured social muscles that had been bruised by arrogance. While the repairs progressed, legal pressure increased. The county filed criminal charges against the HOA for willful trespass and environmental negligence. Halston hired more lawyers and launched aggressive countersuits designed to tie up county resources. The sheriff's office increased patrols at the pump house and set up a hotline for suspicious activity. That should have been enough to deter further escalation, but men like Halston don't stop when rules press on them. They change tactics. He aimed to hit where the law couldn't easily reach: reputation, allies, and the soft underbelly of community trust. The turning point came when a whistleblower and HOA contractor with a conscience and a memory of late-night calls walked. into my lawyer's office, clutching a USB drive and a trembling wallet. He was small and rough-handed. The kind of man who'd worked the construction trenches and knew exactly who signed the checks and who cut corners. His evidence blew open the HOA's informal ledger, payments laundered through shell vendors, coded emails that linked board members to contractors, and messages showing Halston's direct orders to bypass inspections. The contractor's testimony smelled of fear and relief at once. He'd been threatened, paid off, and then left out when the board needed a body to take the fall. Now he wanted out. We gave him protection and promised to keep him anonymous until the county had a secure way to use his evidence. With the whistleblower's documents, things inched from suspicion toward prosecution. They were the kind of details that, when woven into a legal tapestry, made a clear portrait of intent. We handed the material to the county DA, who had the appetite to see a case through when the evidence looked neat and damning. He moved faster than Halston expected. Subpoenas went out. Bank accounts were scrutinized. And a cold clinical process began to strip away the comfort of plausible deniability. Halston wasn't a man accustomed to being stripped. He lashed at the DA publicly, called the investigation a witch hunt, and rallied those still loyal to him. But the more he roared, the more his allies' nerves frayed. As arrests and indictments loomed, a hush spread across the subdivision like a winter fog. Board members who'd once been smugly assured of their status now avoided eye contact at the grocery store. A few tried to rally support, organizing town forums full of canned talking points and managed outrage. But when the DA presented the documents at a public hearing, the town watched in real time as timelines and transactions proved the work had been planned, paid for, and executed with the explicit knowledge that the HOA lacked authorization. The city council, embarrassed and outraged, moved to suspend the board indefinitely and appointed a receiver to oversee all HOA projects and finance until proper governance could be restored. Halston's world, the small kingdom he had cultivated, collapsed outward in a slow, humiliating implosion. He lashed out privately in threatening phone calls that recorded as evidence against him. And in public, he tried to maintain dignity he no longer possessed. He looked like a man who'd been arrested by his own conscience. Yet for all the legal victories, I remained watchful. Power, especially the filthy, obsessive kind, becomes unpredictable in defeat. The night before the county prepared a final, decisive hearing. I felt the familiar prelude to danger. The air grew heavy. The coyotes kept their distance, and the ranch seemed to hold its breath. Hank locked the gates and finished the rounds. Mara stayed close by my boots, as if sensing an order hidden in the wind. I checked the pump house, the valves, the newly installed alarm sensors, and the CCTV feeds. The receivership hadn't yet taken formal control, but the presence of investigators everywhere made the moment feel vulnerable. I slept none that night, a thin mixture of anticipation and the cold knowledge that men like Halston had nothing left to lose. Sometime after midnight, a sound drifted across the property, a low, constant vibration like a muscle twitch in the earth. Headlights bloomed at the end of the driveway, 3 of them, approaching slow and deliberate. Vehicle engines cut off. Footsteps approached the pump house in measured silence. Hank whispered into his radio, breath of fog in the air. Someone's here. Multiple people. Unmarked truck. Move to the perimeter. Do not engage until we know. I felt a hollowing in my gut. A primal tightening echoed in every bone. This was no longer a legal skirmish. It smelled like sabotage. The CCTV picked up silhouettes moving with unnatural caution gloves, hooded jackets, the kind of coordinated stealth that suggests professional planning. My phone buzzed with a single message from an anonymous number. Make a choice. Back down, and they walk away. The message was brash. The threat was obvious. I set the phone down, breathed, and reached for the wrench I kept beside the bed. If they thought midnight shrouded them, they were wrong. The night reveals more than it hides when you know where to look. I moved through the dark like someone who'd known these lands for years because I did. I positioned myself by the northern fence, where the shadows of mesquite trees filled in like hands. Hank took the east perimeter with a flashlight that cut a white arc through the black. Mara padded ahead, muscles taut. nose working like a living scanner. The first figure slipped near the pump house, a soft form against metal siding. He knelt and worked at a lock with practiced hands. Another moved toward the valve box, fingers reaching them like someone rehearsed 1,000 times. Adrenaline. The night split open, and the men with the flashlights scattered like startled birds. The moment sheriff deputies flared their beams, and the receiver's team moved in with warrants and subpoenas. It was almost anticlimactic, years of tension condensed into the brief. Panic of being caught yet, the sound of handcuffs closing around a wrist, carries a peculiar finality. Halston's inner circle tried to scramble, to bribe, to bargain. But the law that had once moved slow now moved with the weight of evidence and the urgency of public outrage. I watched from the ridge as figures were led away under the harsh white light of patrol cars. Their faces wet with something close to shame or maybe the first inkling of regret. The community exhaled. Some cheered. Others stood in stunned silence, the reality of what had happened settling like dust in the gutters of their neat driveways. The camera crews clicked and chattered, their lenses hungry for the closure they could frame into headlines. But the work below the surface, the kind that leaves scars in the soil and distrust in people's hearts, was only beginning to be undone. Over the following weeks, the legal machinery ground forward in ways that made the loudest of Halston's defenders grow quiet. Indictments were filed. Plea bargains were offered to those who'd cooperated. Public records were cleaned with the kind of honesty the community had lacked for years. The receiver took the reins of the HOA and began to untangle the financial knots left by greed, unpaid bids, unexplained expenditures, and the shadowy contracts that had financed the ill-fated pipeline. The county council passed new ordinances. Water projects crossing private property would require public notices, environmental impact assessments, and certified oversight. It was all dependent on sustained civic pressure. And citizens who had once complained about shrubbery now sat in hearings, made statements, and asked smart, uncomfortable questions. The transformation was messy and sincere, an awkward healing where the people who had been part of the problem earned the chance to be part of the solution. One kept working on the land, each day a quiet liturgy of repair. The spring hummed back with a patience all its own. Fed by the retention basin and the newly planted willows weed coaxed into root, Dr. Royce's monitoring showed gradual improvements, turbidity falling, flow stabilizing, the aquifer responding when storms filled the retention pools. The livestock followed the new channels with a trust that steadied me. They do not hold grudges, only memories of seasons. At dawn, before the cameras came, and before any board members thought to polish their public smiling faces, I walked the creek and checked the weirs, measured by hand the water that returned, and listened to the small miracle of a system nudging itself back toward health. It was work that couldn't be televised well, fingers in mud, hands blistered, honest sweat on shirts that smelled like hay and rain. It was the kind of work that reclaims what arrogance stole, piece by careful piece. People changed in ways both small and startling. Claire organized regular community restoration days. Jacob became a volunteer coordinator, his rough hands now tender with seedlings instead of county grudges. Some of Halston's most fervent defenders turned inward, shamed and contrite, and they approached me with apologies that weren't performative, but heavy with honest remorse. A few called refusing to meet my eyes, their silence saying more than any loud apology could. Barbara Sterling, when I finally saw her at a community forum, looked diminished, her voice thin and thick with the weight of what she'd done and what she'd defended. She spoke about restitution and about learning the difference between convenience and care. Whether her remorse was wholehearted or merely the product of public pressure, I could not say. People are complicated, and wounds leave scars that sometimes take years to fade. I accepted some apologies and let others stand in the slowly shifting light of community scrutiny. But even with the arrests and the ordinances, I remained wary. Villains seldom disappear. They reinvent. Halston's prosecution loosened the hold of the worst of the corrupt. But the culture that allowed such theft, small compromises, the shrugging acceptance of it's always been this way, the quiet willingness to let convenience trump care-acquired attention, So I pushed forward not just with lawsuits, but with institutions. Legal trust to hold the spring and a public-private partnership that prioritized ecological health over profit. A community water board staffed by a rotating elected body with real oversight powers. And a public registry of water rights reachable online, so no homeowner could believe any longer that a private board could sweep deeds and documents into secrecy. The trust forbade sell-offs to developers who valued green fees over green banks. And the bylaws required every infrastructure decision to pass through a publicly recorded environmental review. It was a framework for future temperance, an architecture of accountability meant to keep greedy hands from reaching for what didn't belong to them. The town's soul felt different after that. Trar, yes, but also more honest. People learned to ask hard questions. Where does our water come from? Who is accountable for it? What are the limits of community when convenience masks theft? These questions seeded change far beyond our county lines. And I began receiving letters from rural landowners in small towns asking how we did it, how a single rancher could stand against a board and win. I wrote back with blunt counsel: document everything. Demand transparency, build alliances with neighbors and scientists. And above, I'll protect what's beneath your feet because once it's gone, it's very hard to get back. Not everyone celebrated this new vigilance. The developer with his glossy brochures still prowled the periphery, retreating to plots and proposals in other counties, but his model of commodifying water had been publicly rejected, and his representatives' calls were met with firm refusal. Spencer went quiet after indictments and lost influence. Opportunists find fewer buyers in communities that learned the value of public trust. The town rebuilt slowly, carefully, with a humility I hadn't expected to see in a place that had once prized perfect lawns above all else. Lawns stayed shorter. Sprinkler systems were regulated. The community pool hours were adjusted to conserve water. And education campaigns taught kids how the creek worked and why willows mattered. In a sense, the crisis had born a new civic Masilla, tired but powerful resilience. And still, as the lawyers' calendars emptied and the street signs remained, I kept an eye on the horizon because taste for control runs deep in some people. There were late-night calls from neighbors who wondered if we were truly safe. And there were still anonymous notes that arrived now and then, reminders that not all enemies are dead. I trained new alarms, tightened surveillance, and set up a community watch that balanced security with respect. But I also accepted help where it mattered. Nonprofit grants for riparian restoration. A local college partnership for ongoing hydrology studies. And a rotating scholarship program named for my father to teach local youth sustainable land management. The scholarship felt right, turning a bitter battle into something that seeded future stewardship. One morning before the county cleared the final environmental report, I walked to the highest knoll on the ranch and looked out across the patchwork of fields. The repaired trench now regraded in green. The willows balancing their roots against the stream. The town below buzzed with the practical noises of life. Garbage trucks, a school bus, the distant hum of the interstate. I felt a cautious optimism, less like joy, more like the relief of a wound starting to knit. In that quiet, my mind drifted to all the people who had stayed Hank. Mara, Claire, Jacob, Dr. Roysud built a coalition, not of convenience but of stubborn care. They had proved that systems can be altered when ordinary people choose to enforce decency. Still, the story didn't feel finished. There was a deep, dark part of me that preferred the tidy revenge of a single decisive action, turning off faucets. Seeing panic in polite eyes, watching arrogance writhe. But I had traded that for something more enduring, a structure that made future theft harder and accountability easier. The last scene of a story is rarely a clean bow. It's the beginning of a new arc shaped by the lessons learned. Halston's fate would be decided in courtrooms and legal processes that moved slower than the seasons but with greater finality. For now, I had what mattered most: the spring, the ranch, and a community beginning to understand that water is not an entitlement, but a shared heritage requiring vigilance. If you're reading this and you live somewhere with pipelines and polite men who make decisions behind closed doors, here is what I want you to do. Check your deeds, demand transparency, and refuse to let convenience become a cover for theft. Support locals who protect shared resources. Insist on environmental oversight for any infrastructure project. And when you see a wrong disguised as efficiency, stand up. Don't let the small, quiet compromises become the scaffolding for bigger crimes. Tell your neighbors, attend the meetings, document everything, and if necessary, bring scientists and lawyers into the light. The land doesn't plead, it remembers. If you care about your water, your soil, your children's future, act now. Because when power reaches across fences and assumes silence, the only choice left is whether you will be a bystander or a guardian. Choose to be a guardian. The last thing I did that week before stepping back into the routine of repairs was